Hi, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Trouble Begins. We are doing something brand new for us, the first time having a live audience as well as a virtual audience. So I'm going to ask both audiences to be patient with us of which direction we're facing, because we're going to talk to you guys, we're going to talk to the screen, we're going to talk to each other. So it'll be an interesting experience for all of us. So we appreciate you being here on this journey with us. As always, I'm Jodi DeBruyne. I'm the Director of Collections here at the Mark Twain House Museum. I'm going to do a couple admin things before we get started with tonight's program. First and foremost, I'd like to thank CT Humanities, Connecticut Humanities, for funding this program and the Trouble at Home series as well. These programs are also supported by the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York. And speaking of them, if you were part of our technical glitch last month with Jill and Matt from Elmira, we are working on rescheduling that to do an encore performance of that lecture. So stay tuned for dates and times for that. We will get it out to you guys. If anybody in our virtual audience would like to support us, your support is vital to the Mark Twain House Museum. Please donate here button at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to make a contribution to support the Mark Twain House and programs like this, please click that button. Any amount right now really helps us out. $1, $5, more dollars. All of it's greatly appreciated. During this program, on the virtual screen, the chat will be live. If you have any questions, though, please use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, kind of below that Donate Now button. Obviously, feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat, but any questions for Beth and I for us to answer during the Q&A section at the end, please use that Ask a Question feature. We'll take questions from the virtual audience as well as the live audience later. So, yes, and if anybody can't hear us live or virtual at any point in time, please let us know and we'll adjust microphones and all of that. So I think that's all. So without further ado, I will introduce my guest tonight, Elizabeth Burgess from the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Beth is my counterpart over there. She's the Director of Collections and Research. So you got two museum nerds on the stage tonight. Thank you, Beth, so much for joining us.
Yes, Jodi, thanks so much for having me. And a big thank you to our colleagues here at the Mark Twain House. As Jodi said, I've been at the Stowe Center now for a very long time, enough so that I won't say. And I'm steeped in all things Stowe, and Nook Farm especially is a favorite topic of mine, as our collections at the Stowe Center are so rich in that research. And it's just an amazing topic. This place really has seen a lot in its heyday through today, and it's great as a point of reference for the nation, I would argue the world, and its connection to our interpretation today, and its home here as a community resource. So happy to be here.
Great. So I think what we're going to start off with today, Beth, is we keep referring to Nook Farm. It's in the title of this exhibit or of this program, and you just mentioned it multiple times.
Sure.
Nook Farm. Where does that? I mean, were there cows and things? Why is this location called Nook Farm?
Right. Great question. So it was originally a working farm, as you suggest, named for the Nook in the Park River that flows along the west and southern borders of Nook Farm, and it was owned by William Imlay. And he's the man who sold it to Francis Gillette and John Hooker in 1853. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay. So it's named for that Nook in the Park River. The river is such an important part of the city, economically speaking, and it flows, of course, down southeast towards Bushnell Park and into the park. Of course, today it's underground here, as since 1938. But it really was a landmark landscape feature of the neighborhood, making it this picturesque, beautiful place. So that when Gillette and Hooker bought it, it became the mid-19th century landscape that you would want to build a really impressive mansion and show off your wealth. You'd want to live here.
Great. And we, you know, want to build houses here, that kind of thing. This ended up being a really populous kind of neighborhood for the time, right?
Yeah.
There was multiple mansions here and some really kind of important people.
Mhm.
How did it go from John Hooker and Frances Gillette to what we think of it now as a neighborhood, basically?
Right. So Gillette and Hooker bought the property and really sold off plots only to people they knew. We reference this as blood or money at the Stowe Center. So either by birth or their marriage, or if you had enough funds, you could get a plot through Gillette and Hooker. And it was a transaction, right? You sold the land. The archives at the Stowe Center hold a few of these. And you determine which spot would be yours, and then you hire an architect and build a huge house. So the second part of your question was, how do we see it today? So what's remaining, the 6 or so homes, including the Twain and Stowe homes, the Charles Boardman Smith house across Forest Street, Isabella Beecher Hooker's house, and the Catherine Seymour Day house, are really, and then there's an 1895 structure, the former Burton House site, are really what's left. And architecturally speaking, though the land, of course, has been here forever. So it's really changed from an elite gated community without a gate to a more diverse and economically diverse neighborhood, in a place where there's school, there's nonprofit, museums like ours, there's organizations like the Motor Transport Association of Connecticut, and homeowners and apartments. So it's a vibrant community now.
Great, great. So on your guys's, so this little, basically neighbors of us, the Mark Twain House, the Stowe Center, the 2 museums, there's multiple buildings on your property. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those 2? One's the Day House and one's the Stowe House, correct?
Right, of course. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, the internationally famous author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, anti-slavery hit of the 19th century, sold more copies than any other novel in the century, so only outsold by the Bible. So Stowe moves in 1873 to a 2-year-old house that you see there. It was originally a spec house built by Franklin Chamberlain. He lived in it, Franklin and Mary Chamberlain, excuse me. They lived in it for 2 years and then sold it to the Stowes. So she's really at a point in her life where she's downsizing, doesn't need a large mansion anymore, had that built to her own design, and it just didn't work out so well for her on the south edge of Nook Farm, named Nook Farm. So she buys a smaller property and her children are grown, and it becomes a more comfortable Gothic cottage feel, and she stuffs it full of her souvenirs from her travels and her own art, and really makes it a comfortable place. And that is a museum that you can tour today. Of course, we'll reopen that building in January for the public. And then the Catherine Seymour Day House, which was originally built by Franklin and Mary Chamberlain in 1884 for their own home. And it is a aesthetic building, architecturally speaking, it's a gem. I do believe, trying to outdo the Commons in the architecture of the building. It also has a later room on the 3rd floor with still original finish in it. And today it's used as our program space, our office building, and our collections archival space. So it is a multi-purpose building. And we also have our visitor center, which is Carriage House, the former Carriage House built for the chamber to use. And that serves as our visitor center.
Great. So you said that the Harriet Beecher Stowe house built and kind of moved in 1873. And of course, we know that the Mark Twain house was built in 1874. So this means that Twain and Stowe were actually neighbors, just kind of like you and I are today working. They were here at the same time. So can you tell us a little bit about what type of relationship these 2 authors had?
That's a great question. And let's go back and forth on this.
Yeah.
So Twain and Stowe were very cordial neighbors. One thing to remember is that Stowe is a generation older than Clemens, so she's in her 60s when she first moved in, and he's in his about 40s, is that right? Mm-hmm. So generationally different. She's a grandmother, he's a father, coming from different places. He and her place, and he's from Missouri. So different backgrounds altogether. But I think it's fascinating that they come together over literature and discussions. We've got a couple of great stories. One, of course, is that famous meeting with George Griffin bringing over hat and a tie on a platter, on a tray, because Twain forgot to wear those when last calling on Stowe, and she writes back a letter saying, "We discovered a principal, and then they call by installments." So it's really cute. And then also there's, let's see, in the archive, there's a watercolor of Calvin Stowe rocking on a chair on the Emperor, 1877, I believe that's dated. So you could just see that they're in and out of each other's homes, which was typical of the neighborhood, really. Even if you weren't at home, Isabella or someone else, future hooker, excuse me, might just bring someone visiting to a different house and just show it off. Because who's going to mind, right? They want to show off their friends and neighbors. Clemens.
So I'm also going to ask you to speak a little bit louder and towards the computer. Yep.
Pardon me.
I know there's multiple microphones to look through, so we're gonna try to get the virtual audience to hear us a little bit better. So yep.
So there's a great article called "Hartford, a Capital City," published in Harper's Magazine. Boy, I forgot. It's about 1880 or so, and discusses a journalist spending time in Hartford and coming to have a meal at Clemens' home, where Stowe and Calvin Stowe are present. And there's a great discussion. I forget now. I think Charles W. Wonder might also be there. But it's very obvious they have a cordial relationship. They get along well together. They're clearly both at different points in their career. And it makes for some great discussion. I think it's really a transition between, if I can say, a generational Nook Farm, right? So the Gillette, the Hookers, are maybe first generation, and then arguably Twain, the Warners there earlier. He comes to the height of his career at the same time, and others. So I think that's general.
Yeah. So during that little explanation of Twain's and Stowe's kind of relationship, you mentioned a couple other names of Warner and Harper and things like that. Can you explain a little bit about who those people were in relation to these two neighbors?
Sure. So Charles Dudley Warner was, the friend of General Joseph Hawley, which is the reason why he comes to live in Nook Farm. Hawley is related by marriage to the Beechers. Wonderful people in their own right. Whole other topic. So Charles Dudley Warner becomes the editor of the Hartford Courant, first evening press, right, and then merges with the Courant later. So those are both abolitionist papers, and he writes articles about the war while Hawley is away fighting for the Union. Though interestingly enough, they decide to talk about home topics and less about what's happening on the battlefield. So there's some more interest there, some more reading I want to do there. So Charles Warner becomes very famous as the author of The Gilded Age, co-authored with Mark Twain, and backlog studies, and a number of others. But he's really a critic and essayist. And I read a book recently called, let's see, I forgot it. It was Mickey Pfeffer's book about Grace King and her visit to Nook Farm, really laying interesting perspective down about the relationship between Warner, the Clemenses, and the rest of Nook Farm. So if you're interested, it would be a great read, a different perspective completely on the neighborhood. For me, it changed the way I think of it. So suggest it.
Cool. So is there, being a collections person myself, is there anything, do you have like a favorite item in the Stowe collection that kind of talks about Nook Farm or represents Nook Farm or this kind of like elite neighborhood that Stowe and Clemens were a part of?
That's a great question. There are a number. It's hard to choose. I'm personally fascinated with historic preservation. So there are tiles from, I believe it is the Warner house, which originally was the George and Lily Warner home, and then Charles Dudley, his brother, um, and his wife Susan bought the home and lived there. So there's tiles from a parlor, mantle, fireplace around. There's also wallpaper, segments, like sections. And Lily wrote a note on the back saying, Mrs. Stowe really likes this wallpaper. We should put this up in our parlor as well. So elements like that, little tangible pieces of structures, but something else they probably would have touched, are really one of my favorites.
That's really cool. I really like those elements too of the kind of the everyday structural elements or things that people touched. We had an intern over the summer, and part of what she put out was the silverware that belonged to the Clemens family. And it was this idea to her that, oh, this was in Mark Twain's mouth probably at one time. Like he ate off of this. It was such a cool like thing that she could connect to. And so things like that of like, oh, I really like this wallpaper. I think we all have those kind of samples of what paint from Home Depot or Lowe's or something where we've written that note of, oh, I like this color for the bathroom. And so seeing that they did that back then too is just,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's that personal touch that I really, really love.
It's that ephemera, right?
Yep, yep. So, great. Well, what about the Stowe Center today? I know you guys have a really interesting mission and kind of a different interpretation of what a house museum is. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Be happy to. So the Stowe Center's mission is to preserve and interpret Stowe's Hartford home and its historic collections, also to have discussions of her life and work, vibrant discussions, so all aspects of them. And then the last part is to invoke positive change, social justice. How can we use the platforms that Stowe used in her own time to speak out against slavery if we can't relate it to today? So clearly there's a connection between American enslavement of the 1800s and mass incarceration today. So how do we talk about that legacy of racial inequality, except to do it in a place where it happened, here in Nook Farm? So that's what our tours really speak to now. One of the various elements of Stowe and who she was, but it's really a platform. Her story is a platform for where we can go and take off. Certainly we can talk about, household management. We can talk about through her home domestic guides, like the American Women's Home, or women's rights in conjunction with her sister Isabella Beecher Hooker and the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote. So the Stowe House is a platform for what we need it to be, but we really focus our energy on connecting the social justice then with the social justice today.
Very cool. And I know that, being these Nook Farm neighbors, we've talked about Stowe and Clemens himself kind of crossing, the lawn and things like that. But so we do that here, right? You guys, we work together, and I know our education groups work together on Nook Farm neighbors and things like that. So even though we here at the Mark Twain House kind of have a more traditional, walk through the historic house and interpret it as the way the family lived and kind of bring you back in time, the two kind of, bridging the gap between yesteryear and today. It's still kind of done, what's the word I'm looking for? Collaboratively between the three houses here on property. So is there anything else you can tell us about the house itself and what it, when Harriet Beecher Stowe lived there, what was, do we know if he had a favorite room? We know that Twain spent a lot of time in his billiard rooms with his friends, and that's where he wrote and things like that. So are there any stories from the house or about the house you'd like to share with us?
Boy, there are so many, it's hard to choose one. Um, I would argue that the dining room or the public parlor, the back parlor, would be the spaces that Stowe would have hosted parties and had these discussions about current events and what it means to social change and reform. Um, but it's also, arguably, the spaces she used to write and to voice her opinion, use her pen and paper to make a change. So, the front parlor where her desk would have been, or her bedroom where she would have wrote, all times and day of the day, wherever she was comfortable. I think that the whole house tells stories. It's hard, again, to choose just one, but I am proud to say that when it was restored a few years back, we really spent a lot of time trying to get it just right, the way it would have looked in her time. So if you have time to come back when we're open again in January, I do urge you to. If you haven't been in a number of years, it's a great restoration. So proud of that team.
So you mentioned that when she lived here, it was kind of towards the later end of her life and things. I believe she passed away in 1896.
That's correct. Yeah.
This is after Uncle Tom's Cabin, correct? And so what was she writing during this time? Was she still really prolific up until the end of her life, or was it smaller kind of essay kind of things?
That's a great question. So she is still writing here in Nook Farm, and if you stretch it back to the Oakhome period, which is about 1863, it's even more work that she's doing in Nook Farm. But here in this house, yes, so she would have written Podunk People, which is her last true novel at this time in 1878. A number of other short essays would have been published. As a savvy businesswoman, she would have clustered a number of short stories together, and the publishers would have reissued them under different titles. But she's also doing activist work around animal rights and, of course, continuing on what she feels is women's rights, which started with the Lady Byron controversy, the true story of Lady Byron and Lady Byron Vindicated. So the work, her using her voice to make statements is still something she's doing here in Nook Farm, either by suggesting or recommending where you should go to dinner, who you should visit while you're in town, what you should read. She's going to use that platform to do that. So yeah, she's still a very active person. She does suffer from dementia the last 10 or so years of her life, but in Nook Farm as a community is very neighborly about that. So it's in effect was a great place for her and her family to finish up a very long life, a very productive long life.
And you mentioned very early on, Mark Twain's here as a father, and she's a grandmother. So tell us a little bit about Stowe's family life. I don't even know if I know how many kids she had and those kinds of things. So what did that look like? Were her family close by? Were they, elsewhere?
So Stowe's family, she had 7 children. And when they live here in this house, most of them are grown. She has her youngest son, Charles, when they first move in, is attending Harvard, and he's home on summer break in this house. Later, after he's married, he brings back his very young family with 2 little children, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, I believe. And they live on the 3rd floor for about 3 months while they're waiting for their home on Florence Street here in Hartford to be finished. So you can just imagine what it was like, to live with your grandchildren in your house. Living in a multi-generational household myself, it's a wonderful experience. There's so many layers to that, and we know that Stowe relished being a grandmother. She just, poured on and spoiled these children the way she did with her own children, in fact, and maybe even worse because it's the Gilded Age. So she really had a great time. There's a lot of correspondence back and forth with her grandchildren, sending them her books, of course, and telling them to be good children. But here's some Valentine's cards, some Easter cards. I have this for you. Especially her daughter Georgiana's son, Freeman Allen, was incredibly gifted, and Stowe gave him many things. So out of those 7 children, 2 of them had grandchildren. So there are descendants today from those children, but really none of them lived in Nook Farm. One in Hartford for a while, and then he moved out to Simsbury. But the rest are just visiting in and out.
Very cool. And so the other house, the what we now refer to the day house, I know it has couple names there. So Catherine Day, I know that she was a huge mover and shaker for the Mark Twain House to actually get us to become a museum. And I actually verified this with a coworker of mine today that she also helped create the Stowe Museum. So can you tell us a little bit about Catherine Day?
Sure. So Catherine Seymour Day is the granddaughter of John and Isabella Beecher Hooker. On her maternal side, she is also a descendant from a lot of other Connecticut founding families, the Days, the Seymours, and then the Beechers and Hookers. So very Yankee person. And she purchases the Stowe house in 1924 in order to save it. So she's born in 1870 and visits Nook Farm. Lives in another part of Hartford. Visits Nook Farm often to visit Great Aunt Hattie and her grandmother Isabella and grandfather. So she knows what it was like here and remembers the heyday of Nook Farm. And she thinks it deserves to be saved. This is at a time in Hartford when transitions are happening in the post-industrial revolution, so about 1920s, 30s. It's also the rise of historic preservation and civic engagement. The Connecticut DAR is formed, Colonial Dames, and she's a part of all of that, trying to save her history here. So she saves the Stowe house in 1924, and she lives in it until her death in 1964. During that time, she's part of the Friends of the Mark Twain House and helps to save that. And I think for a while, Jodi, I'm not wrong, she was president of that group for a while.
Yep, she was. Yeah, and I've been going through our collection records a lot lately just to familiarize myself with what the museum owns and things like that. And her name shows up over and over and over again on all of the records. And so it's like, who is this Catherine Day?
Oh, you have to take that
how do I thank her for giving me all these beautiful things to look at? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's a fascinating person. I think we're just beginning to really look at her in new perspectives, and some new research is being done about her, specifically tied to her art and this time period of the 20s and 30s here in Hartford. There were 2 exhibits upcoming, which will be back up in 2021. I would encourage you to go see if you're interested in Catherine Seymour Day. One will be at the University of St. Joseph's, and the other at the Town and County Club. So 2 separate, tied to the centennial of 1920 and women artists specifically, because that's another thing she did was paint prolifically, so much so that the 3rd floor of the Day House has thousands of paintings in it.
Wow, that's a lot of paintings. I can even imagine.
Wait till you get your tour, Jodi. It's great.
I know. I started here at the end of January, and so I was only here for a few weeks before we started working from home and things. So I haven't actually got a chance to go into either the Stowe Center or the Day House yet. So I'm learning it from the outside and from Beth via email. So I'm anxiously awaiting my chance to get to go into these houses and see what they look like inside and browse the collections with Beth. So
yeah, can't wait.
Yeah. Great. Well, so we're about at a half hour, and I do want to make sure we have our 15 minutes for Q&A and things. So does our on-site audience have any questions for Beth and what we've talked about?
Retired to Hartford, and I know she was born in Litchfield.
Yeah.
But why did she just come to Hartford because it was a nice place to live? I mean, she'd already written the book. Why did she retire here?
So for our virtual audience, the question is, why did Harriet Beecher Stowe basically retire here to Hartford?
That's a great question. She retires to Hartford because she went to school here in the 1820s at her sister's Hartford Female Seminary. And so she has fond remembrances of this place and loved it, loved specifically the river. So when she first moves back, it's to live at Oakhome, that first mansion we talked about. And it's right, she builds it right on the edge of the river. So if you know where the United Way building is off of Capitol Avenue, that is practically where Oakhome stood originally. So if you can imagine how beautiful and flowing it would have been. But that's the reason. So they wait till Calvin Stowe retires in 1862 from teaching. He was a professor of theology. And then they move back here.
So one of our virtual questions is, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, I do not. I know a little bit about here at the Mark Twain House, but generally speaking, have there been any horticultural studies of the Nook Farm properties or research into the gardening and landscaping of Nook Farm?
That's a great question. And I see that Judith Lohman, one of our longtime garden volunteers, is asking a similar question. So hi, Judith.
Yep. Oh yeah, in the chat. Yep.
Yes. So the Stowe Nook Farm gardens would have been just as dramatic as you see today, probably in a slightly different layout. But yes, so in a picturesque landscape like Nook Farm, this community was originally built to be, you would have seen, natural sort of outcroppings along beautiful, rustic fences, clustered some near the house, some without, beds purposefully made, and then others just sort of jumbled together, as Stowe says. So yes, there are research. Both the Stowe Center and the Mark Twain House have historic landscape reports, which I think we can make ours publicly available if others are interested, but you can also make a research appointment to see it if of interest. Let's see, and the gardens today are, at the Stowe Center anyway, an interpretation of what Stowe had, layered with others common to the period. What we know she painted. Stowe was a floral and landscape artist as well in her spare time, and what she wrote about. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface on that research as well. So a really great topic, especially tied to Nook Farm and women's lived experiences in the 19th century too.
Yeah, and I'll just say, just like Beth just said, the gardens here are, we do have the historic reports, and we do kind of mix what we know they had versus, and some, of the time period. I'm going to do two kind of shameless plugs here for us also of myself and our school group coordinator, Erin, do a YouTube series called Catching Up with the Clemenses. And our last one was all about the greenhouse that used to sit here between the two properties. So if you search through our website or our Facebook page or anything like that, you can see that YouTube series. It is geared for kids, but it's a lot of fun for adults too. The other thing that I'll plug is that this Saturday, the 13th of September, we're having our first annual garden sale here at the Mark Twain House. So I think it starts at noon.
I'm sure it's on your website, right?
It's on our website. It's during the afternoon, and our gardener, Christy, who maintains the ground with her great group of volunteers, has, I think, over 300 plants, house plants, outdoor plants, everything. So if you're a gardener, stop by on Saturday and see what you can pick up.
I'll be there, yeah.
Back to the questions. Yes.
So a lot is made of the relationship of Joe Mitchell with Sam. But I was wondering, did he have a relationship at all with Harriet Beecher Stowe?
Definitely. Oh, sorry.
So the question is, did Joseph Twitchell have any relationship with Harriet Beecher Stowe, since we know he did with Sam Clemens?
Yes, the answer is yes. Would have been just as friendly with them. Of course, not as close of a relationship as with Mark Twain. But Joe Twitchell, the pastor of the Asylum Hill Congregational Church, which was built, I think, shortly after, or mid 1860s, really to for this community of Nook Farm, Calvin Stowe was one of the original founders of that church. I believe his name is on a plaque somewhere inside. And we know he gave Bible classes there in his spare time, but he didn't really preach so much. So there would have been a connection with the family. And there's a great story about how Stowe, sometime in the 1870s, went to Florida where she had a winter home. And she left her initial few chapters of Uncle Tom's Cabin, her manuscript, with Twitchell because she wanted it safeguarded. They often rented the Stowe house out during their absence. And apparently one of his children, young children, found it and started gnawing on it, which is great if you think about it. So there's that story. And then also Twitchell wrote an article about Stowe. I might get this wrong, but I think it's Authors at Home, around right before her death, and really describes the home and it's the way the decor is set and designed. So it's one of the documents we use to really help inform what the house looks like today. So yeah, there would have been a very cordial relationship there. His religious views were very similar to her brother, Henry Ward Beecher's. So they would have gotten along splendidly.
I think he lived over on Woodland Street. Too.
Did. Yes, technically outside,
Yeah.
but very close. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a shameless plug for Steve Courtney's book, biography of Joseph Twitchell. If you haven't read it, it's amazing.
And it's coming out in paperback in a couple months. And so Steve Courtney will be our December Trouble Begins guest. So stay tuned for that. So lots of plugs tonight. But yeah, no, the book's coming out in paperback. So if you don't already have a copy, it'll be a great Christmas gift for everybody on your list. So going to our next Trouble Begins guest, Kevin McDonald asks, are there oral histories of Nook Farm by the children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of the original residents?
That is a great question. Boy, Bridget, feel free to shout out. So Catherine Seymour Day has a lot of oral history about what she remembers. Emily Perkins Knapp is another relation, same era so would have been born about 1870. Great remembrances as well. She's the one who remembers the orange trees in the Stowe House dining room. Isn't there Clara remembrances?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Clara is my father playing.
Yep.
And I would say some of not being Gillette himself, but possibly his sister.
Yeah.
So for virtually who can't hear that, we just said that Clara has my father, Mark Twain, and potentially some of Gillette's descendants have some oral histories or
Actually, it's his sister, Lily Gillette Warner.
Okay.
Her archives are at the Stowe Center, and almost daily information about what's going on in this neighborhood. So great resource as well.
Awesome. Any questions from? Yes. So the question is, did Nook Farm attract curiosity seekers, people who wanted to come and meet the writers and other people who lived here?
I would say yes. I think that I can't think of a negative experience in that way, but we do know that Stowe had people knock on the door and say who they were, could they meet with her. And she either chose to meet with you then, as was the custom, or you could leave your calling card, right, and call back. Yeah, there's a chance that, what's his name? John Andrew Jackson, for example, was a fugitive slave in the 1850s who ran to Brunswick, Maine. He made his way up to Brunswick, Maine, where Stowe was living, where she was writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he tried to get in and have a night's rest in the houses in Brunswick, Maine, and no one would let him in except for Stowe. She took him in. And then we think later, still a little shaky, that he came back to visit her at this house. So he would have been a similar onlooker, but there would have been reporters writing articles about Stowe in her home. There's easily 10 of those published that describe Mrs. Stowe in her older years.
Okay. So a question from our online audience is, it's a little bit about the kind of geography here. It says, were both properties cut out from Frank Chamberlain's lot on Farmington Avenue by bridge over Park River? So do you know how the lots were divided prior to Stowe and Twain getting theirs?
Chamberlain owned the entire corner, is my understanding. I don't exactly know the size and shape of it, but my understanding is Chamberlain's the one who sold the Clemens their land, not Gillette and Hooker directly. And then he also built the Stowe house and its twin house, the Hall Porter house, which stood where our parking lot is today. Those two houses as spec houses, and then retained the Day House lot for his own, and then came back and built the Day House 10 years later. So I believe that's how it went down. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm still learning, so I don't know if you're wrong. So we might get a couple comments if we are, but great. Back to the live audience for questions? Yes.
Yes. So a spec house.
The question, I know it's a new age. The question for a virtual audience asked by the live audience is, what is a spec house?
So spec is short for speculation, right? So built by a builder in order to just sell it right away, hopes that it will sell. So if you go to a new development, they'll generally have one example house built for you to tour. That's an idea of what the Stowe house would have been. The Stowe house and the Hall Porter house, in effect, its twin, are based architecturally off of A.J. Downing's examples, Gothic cottages. So these are architectural plans that were published, easily and readily buildable in a very popular style. So there's really, dare I say, nothing too fancy about them. Very common at the time. What is different is the way you design and decorate the interior and the outside. So Stowe is really looking to not have to worry about all of that anymore after building Oak Home and moving out of that large mansion. She just wants something ready and ready for her family to move into. And she finds that in Mr. Chamberlain's little house.
Great. So it's not a question here, but it is something that you mentioned might be a question. You want to talk about religion a little bit more?
Oh, yes. Yes, I was prepared for my father. Yeah. So I don't sit here to ask questions about religion. So I did some more research into this just to be ready. Let's see, where to begin? Nathaniel Burton was the pastor of the Fourth Congregational Church on Main Street, which was really the abolitionist church here in Hartford, and where early Nook Farm, the Hookers, the Gillettes, Burton, of course, himself, attended. They lived out here, went in downtown for church. So the religion here in Hartford is based off of Horace Bushnell, right? So he's the minister of Center Church. He's really the guiding force behind what comes after him. So the triumvirate, as Kenneth Andrews calls them, are Joel Parker, and it's not Joel Parker. Oh, I lost his first name, Edwin something Parker, and Nathaniel Burton. So they're really his disciples, according to Kenneth Andrews, who writes Nook Farm, Mark Twain Circle in 1950, which is really the only in-depth look of Nook Farm from beginning to end. So the religion, Horace Bushnell very clearly approves and accepts Henry Ward Beecher's ideas and thoughts. And in fact, they are very close, have a close relationship themselves. So as American culture and thought around Calvinism ends, right, the early New England Congregationalism ends, so it's less fire and brimstone and moving into a more love acceptance, Jesus, Christianity. Jesus is a lover, providing love to us. So it's less he's going to hurt you than he is going to love you. They're accepting and moving into this role. So goes from Bushnell to Burton here in Nook Farm, and then Twitchell once Asylum Hill Congregational Church is built. So unlike Boston and New York, where we have a lot of Unitarian movements beginning, that sort of fizzles out in Hartford because Bushnell is such a strong representative of and voice in the community.
Right. Any more on-site audience questions? You can think we have a couple more virtual, so it looks like we have potentially have at least 2 more virtual ones. One is, how was Uncle Tom's Cabin received in Confederate states? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Great question, and complex. So I'll try and keep it short. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, being the best-selling novel of the 19th century, really sold to a market of white Northern women, and specifically, middle-class women. That's who Stowe was writing to, women just like herself. That is not to say that it didn't really start, this sort of mass market control, out of control, as it became such a popular book, like Harry Potter or others today, right? So it was not well received by those who, in the South specifically, who were pro-slavery. It is basically calling them out, that culture out, as harming humans. So there's a few other books were written called anti-Tom novels, published from Southern authors. Aunt Phyllis's Cabin being one of them, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, Life as It Really Is in the South, really to switch the story around and say, no, this is what it's really like. People are taken care of here, and we treat everyone like family. When in effect, of course, that isn't what's happening. So that is not to say that there weren't some Southerners who did agree with Stowe, but in effect, largely, it was not well received in the South. Stowe did receive death threats, that are documented after the book was published. I would urge you, we can go on for hours about this topic, come back for a house tour, or enjoy some of our programming once we're open again in January. It would have definitely been what Stowe was known for here. You're coming to see the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And while it wasn't the only book Stowe wrote for 30, it is her most remembered work.
Yeah, so just following up on that, so she wintered in Florida.
Yeah.
How did that work out for her? Probably.
The follow-up question for our virtual audience is, when Stowe vacationed, wintered in Florida, did she have any problems?
So Stowe goes to Florida for the first time in 1867, so during Reconstruction, so after the Civil War. So the South is in effect defeated. The North is coming in, trying to set up education for formerly enslaved people and rebuild the economy. So she's coming down at a so-called safe time, with male escorts and as her brother, in the form of her brother. And then they set up a home in Mandarin, Florida, which is 20 miles south of Jacksonville on the St. Johns River. She experiences some, but not really enough to make her want to leave. She owns that home and that property for over 20 years. She really tries to make it a community of like-minded people. In the way that Nook Farm was built, she tries to develop Mandarin, Florida, that way. She brings her brother, Charles Beecher, down, and he becomes the Department of Education for the state of Florida. She gets involved with the Freedmen's Bureau in building homes, churches for formerly enslaved people. So really puts a lot of time and effort into that. Palmetto Leaves is a book she writes as a travel journal, really trying to encourage others from the North to come down and winter in the South. So it's part plug and part genuine interest in helping people who need help in an economy that needs to be rebuilt.
Any other follow-ups to that question? Okay. I think the last one that we have here virtually is kind of going back to her family. I know the Clemens girls, Susie, Clara, and Jean, were good friends with the Warner girls and other children in the area. But did the grandchildren of Stowe ever play with the girls? Do we know? Did they interact?
That's a great question. I cannot think of such an interaction, right? I think they would have been a bit older at that point, I believe, right? The Clemens girls are born in the 70s, is that
Mhm.
right? So Stowe's oldest grandson is also born in 1870, but they're living in Boston, so he's visiting only occasionally. I don't think so, no. But I do think that story about the Clemens girls, Daisy Warner, and so many others, it's such an interesting. So what would you call them? The third generation Nook Farm?
Right.
Can you imagine that childhood? My goodness.
Right, growing up and having your
Yeah.
friends over to these lovely houses and you know the first floor rooms that are so immaculately dressed out for visitors and somebody asked about the you know the curiosity coming to see you know the writers and things and you know there's the mahogany suite in the Mark Twain house is just for guests and things and we know that the Clemenses entertained dinner multiple times a week and things like that. So I just imagine being a little girl during that time. I mean, we know they had a lot of fun and put on plays and things like that, but it's so far removed from what I did as a child, you know. So
Definitely, yeah. Great to have all of these stories. I think it's also important, if I may just pop in, to look at the people who worked in Nook Farm. That's a place where we're still trying to garner information more about. And I know that, Jodi, your living history tours focus on the staff of the Mark Twain House, so and the people who worked for the family. So I think that's great. You know, there's more work to be done, and always to get the voices of others involved here. So I look forward to working more on that myself.
yeah. So I think that's all of our virtual questions that I see. Any other questions from our live audience? Yeah.
So, coming back to what we talked about in the trip to Florida, thinking that from here to Florida now is a pretty good long trip, although the northern part is not as far as all the way to Miami or something. But how did they travel with the by railroad and how did it take multiple days?
So the question for our virtual audience is that we're going back to Stowe's trips down to Florida, and that it's you know it's a good long drive or at least a good long plane ride still today. So how did they travel back then to get to Florida, and kind of maybe approximately how long did it take to get for Stowe to get from Hartford to her hometown of Florida?
Great question. I just had a research inquiry about this. So it would take about 2 weeks in total for them to get the entire household because they're moving furniture and people and staff to Florida. So yes, it's by railway. From usually Hartford to New York, they would stop in Brooklyn, visit with Henry Ward Beecher, and then leave from there, sometimes on a train, direct, with a stop in South Carolina, or generally South Carolina, Fernandina, or is that Florida? Anyway, St. Augustine definitely is generally the place of export to Jacksonville. So you either boat or train, but generally from St. Augustine on, you're on a boat. Kind of Aquala, I think, was the name of that line. But someone had a question just this week about a line out of Mystic going direct to a boat, a ship, going direct to those areas as well. So it's possible that she took some of those too, but there would have been multiple ways. Her daughters really had to manage the move of the house, getting it there. So I'm sure there was a lot more in play for that reason.
Another question from our virtual audience just popped. They kind of move as people vote on them. So just kind of quickly, can you describe a little bit more of the interaction between the Stowes and the family of William Gillette?
Great, yes. Pardon me. So Frances Gillette and Eliza Hooker Gillette are one of the founding families, excuse me, of Nook Farm. And William Gillette is the youngest son. He's born in 1853, so the same year that they really, in effect, start Nook Farm. There are many other older siblings. Lily Gillette marries Charles Dudley Warner's brother. So she's in effect raising young William and teaching him until he attends public school here. He does go to Harper Public High. And then there would have been Robert Gillette, who was a Civil War soldier, unfortunately died during the war. They had another son, I think Frank, who died, but would have lived here a little bit. So a lot of tragedy. Anyway, the Gillette family and the Stowe family would have known each other through the Hookers, especially because Stowe's sister married John Hooker. So they would have been in this community and in this discussion. They're also very like-minded abolitionists. So Francis Gillette was quite an individual. I was surprised to find that there's no biography on him. He needs a biography. U.S. representative, state senator, also board of the Connecticut Normal School, so very involved in education. He also helps found the Republican Party in Hartford and Connecticut, and is, I believe, a founder of the Hartford Evening Press, which is the abolitionist paper, the Republican paper at the time. So yeah, interesting. We don't have so much more information about Frances Gillette in communication with Stowe. In looking through her letters, there's not a whole lot direct correspondence, but through the Hookers, there is this little bits of family information back and forth. The Stowe Center collections do include the Gillette family papers and the William Gillette collection, which is on loan from the Connecticut State Library. So you can come and schedule a research appointment to look through any and all of that, including William Gillette's handwritten, sometimes typewritten screenplays, which are fascinating.
Great. Last call for questions. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, both here on site with me and Beth and virtually for joining us this evening. I've been definitely watching the comments, and I appreciate, we are wearing masks because we are in person with people, but as we continue to do these events and continue to learn and things, we will adapt and get a better microphone and things like that. We're working with the tech we have and going on. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for being here. It's been so great to have faces both virtually in the audience. So I really can't thank you guys enough. I do want to let everybody know that it's 10:30 to 3:30 for the garden sale on Saturday. And our next Trouble Begins is on October 14th at 5:30. It will be virtual only because our guest, Kevin McDonald, is in Texas. He will be talking about the voice of Mark Twain. So it's going to be a really interesting program. You don't want to miss it. We'll have I think the links are already on our Facebook page and on our website to register for that event, October 14th at 5:30. So we will see you then. And thank you all again so much for being here.
Thank you.